The desert wind moved across the red plains of Kepler 442b and carried dust that settled on everything around the small ranch. Jake Morrison stood on his porch and watched the two suns go down below the hills in the distance. He held a cup of coffee in his rough hands and took a slow drink. The taste was bitter, but he liked it that way. It reminded him of simpler times, even though his life had never really been simple until now. He had lived on this colony world for 5 years, since he left his old job behind. The ranch went on for miles in every direction, and he raised cattle that came from Earth, but changed to live on this strange planet. His neighbors were far away, and that was exactly what he wanted. No crowds and no noise and no questions about who he used to be. His wife Linda came out through the door and stood next to him. She pulled a thick cloth around her shoulders because the air was getting cold now that the suns were gone. Her hair was gray now, but her eyes were still sharp and missed nothing. She looked at the horizon and then at her husband and smiled a little. They did not need to talk much anymore because they understood each other without words. The ranch house was small and looked old from the outside. The walls were made from local stone and the roof was metal that had turned brown from the dust storms. Inside it was comfortable with furniture they built themselves and pictures on the walls from their life together. There was a kitchen with a table and 2 chairs and a living room with a couch that was worn but soft. Their bedroom was in the back, and next to it was a small room they used for storage. Jake looked at his hands and saw the scars that covered them. Each one told a story, but he did not think about those stories anymore. He had spent too many years fighting and planning and losing people he cared about. Out here on the frontier, he could work with his hands and see real results. Fix a fence and the cattle stayed safe. Plant crops and food grew. Simple problems with simple answers. Linda went back inside and started making dinner. Jake could smell something cooking, and his stomach reminded him that he had not eaten since morning. He finished his coffee and set the cup down on the porch rail. The first stars were coming out now, and he recognized some of them. He had been to many of those stars during his career. He had seen things that most people could not imagine and done things he wished he could forget. But that was over now. He was just a rancher, an old man who raised cattle and fixed machines and watched the sunsets. Nobody out here knew his real history, and he wanted to keep it that way. The colonial government had his records sealed as part of his retirement agreement. As far as anyone knew, he was just another veteran who wanted peace and quiet. The communication terminal inside the house made a soft sound. Someone was trying to contact them, but Jake ignored it. Messages could wait until tomorrow. Out here, time moved differently, and there was no rush for anything. If it was important, they would call again. He walked around the porch and checked the perimeter like he did every night. It was habit from his old life, but it also made sense out here. The frontier had dangers that city people never thought about. Wild animals that were not really animals, and weather that could kill you if you were careless, and sometimes people who thought a remote ranch was an easy target. The security system was basic, or at least it looked basic. Simple motion sensors around the property line and cameras at the corners of the house. Standard equipment that any rancher would have. But Jake had made some modifications that nobody could see. Extra systems hidden in the walls and under the ground. Backup power sources and emergency protocols, just in case. Linda called him in for dinner, and he went inside and locked the door behind him. They ate together at the kitchen table and talked about normal things. The fence in the north pasture needed repair. One of the cows was going to have a calf soon. The supply ship would come next week, and they needed to make a list. After dinner, Jake cleaned the dishes while Linda read a book on her tablet. The house was quiet except for the sound of water and the wind outside. This was their life now, and Jake was grateful for it. He had earned this peace with decades of service and sacrifice. He had done his duty and more than his duty, and now he could rest. But some part of him never really rested. Some part of him was always watching and listening and calculating threats. It was built into him after so many years, and he could not turn it off completely. Linda was the same way. They were both trained to notice things that other people missed. The way shadows fell and sounds that did not belong, and the feeling when something was wrong. Tonight everything seemed normal. The wind blew and the house settled, and the darkness outside was complete except for the stars. Jake went to bed and lay down next to his wife. She was already half asleep, but she reached over and took his hand. He squeezed back and closed his eyes. He did not know that 5 miles away a ship had landed behind the rocky hills. He did not know that 12 people were setting up camp and planning to visit his ranch in the morning. He did not know that they thought he was just an old man with no way to defend himself, but he would find out soon enough. And so would they. Jake slept the light sleep of someone who had spent years in dangerous places. Part of his mind stayed alert even when he was dreaming, so when the backup alarm system triggered in the early morning darkness, he was awake instantly. No confusion or grogginess. One moment asleep and the next moment completely aware. Next to him, Linda was also awake. She had heard it too. They did not speak but moved together with the coordination of people who had worked as a team for 30 years. Jake got out of bed and walked quietly to the kitchen. Behind the cabinet was a hidden panel and he opened it. The display showed 12 heat signatures moving toward the house. They were spread out in a tactical formation and carried weapons. Professional or at least experienced. Not random thieves but organized raiders. Jake looked at the screen and then at his wife. She nodded once. They both knew what was about to happen. The quiet life was about to get loud. The raiders came when the sky was still dark, and the 2 moons cast long shadows across the desert. There were 12 of them, and they moved like people who had done this before. They wore mismatched armor and carried weapons that looked expensive and well-maintained. This was not their first raid, and they did not expect it to be their last. Their leader was a man named Vex, who had a long scar running down the left side of his face. He got it in a prison fight 10 years ago and kept it as a reminder of what happened when you were not careful. He was careful now. He watched the ranch house through electronic binoculars and saw no movement. Just a quiet building in the middle of nowhere. Next to him was a woman named Kara who had metal implants running down her left arm. The implants gave her extra strength and let her interface directly with computer systems. She was good at breaking into security and disabling alarms. She had already checked the ranch defenses and found them basic, simple motion sensors and old cameras. Nothing she could not handle. Behind them were 10 more raiders. Some were young and some were older, but all of them had the hard look of people who lived outside the law. They had been hitting frontier ranches for 3 months now and taking whatever they could find. Credits and supplies and sometimes weapons. Most of the ranchers were too scared to fight back, and the ones who tried were not very good at it. Vex had been watching this particular ranch for 2 weeks. He saw the supply ships come and go. He saw the old couple working around the property. They looked soft and slow, easy targets, the kind of people who would hand over everything just to stay alive. He gave the signal and the raiders moved forward. They spread out and approached from 3 directions. Kara stayed in the center and pulled out a small device that looked like a tablet. She pointed it at the house and pressed buttons. The perimeter sensors went dark one by one. Child's play for someone with her skills. The raiders reached the house without triggering any alarms. 2 of them went around back and 2 more covered the sides. The rest gathered at the front door with Vex. He checked his rifle one more time and then nodded to the man next to him. A big guy named Cole who liked breaking things. Cole kicked the door hard and it flew open. The raiders poured inside with weapons ready. They expected to find an old couple sleeping or maybe eating breakfast. Instead, they found an empty living room. The furniture was neat and the lights were on, but nobody was there. Vex moved through the room quickly. His eyes scanned every corner looking for threats. The other raiders spread through the house checking each room. They found a bedroom that looked slept in. They found a bathroom and a storage room. But they did not find the people who lived here. Kara came in through the front door and looked around. Something felt wrong to her, but she could not figure out what. The house was too quiet, too empty, like the people who lived here knew they were coming. Then a voice came from everywhere at once. It came from speakers hidden in the walls and ceiling. The voice was calm and steady. The voice of a man who was not afraid. The voice said they should leave now. It said this was a mistake and they had one chance to walk away. Vex laughed when he heard it. The old man was hiding somewhere and trying to sound tough, trying to scare them away with words. Vex shouted that they were not leaving without payment for their trouble. He told his people to tear the place apart and find anything valuable. He told them to find the old couple and teach them what happened to people who did not cooperate. The voice counted down from 30 seconds. Vex ignored it and kept searching. His raiders opened cabinets and pulled out drawers. They looked under furniture and behind pictures on the walls. Cole punched a hole in the drywall just because he was angry. The voice kept counting. 20 seconds. 15 seconds. 10 seconds. Kara felt the wrongness getting stronger. She wanted to tell Vex they should leave, but she knew he would not listen. He never listened when he thought he was right. The counting reached 0. The voice said time was up. For a moment, nothing happened and Vex smiled. He thought it was all a bluff. He thought the old man was just scared and trying to make them go away. Then the walls opened. Panels that looked like normal wall sections slid back and revealed guns. Not regular guns, but automated turrets that moved on their own. The turrets were small and black and looked very advanced. Much too advanced for a simple ranch house. The turrets started firing before anyone could react. Blue bolts of energy shot across the room and hit 3 raiders. The raiders dropped to the floor and did not move. They were not dead but unconscious. The energy weapons were set to stun, but they hit hard enough to knock someone out instantly. The other raiders started shooting back. Their bullets and energy bolts hit the turrets, but shields appeared in front of them. The shields glowed blue and absorbed the impacts. More turrets came out of other walls. They fired from different angles, and the raiders had to dive for cover. Vex rolled behind a couch and tried to think. This was not possible. A ranch house in the middle of nowhere should not have military-grade defense systems. The turrets were too accurate and too fast. They were tracking multiple targets at once and never missed. Kara hid behind an overturned table and worked frantically on her tablet. She tried to hack into the house systems and shut down the turrets, but the security was too strong. It was not regular civilian encryption. It was military level and she could not break it. Cole fired his rifle at a turret until it exploded. He shouted in victory, but 2 more turrets came out to replace it. One of them shot him in the chest and he went down hard. His armor saved him from serious injury, but he was out of the fight. The raiders who went around back and to the sides tried to come in through other doors, but those doors had sealed shut. Heavy metal barriers dropped down and locked into place. The house had become a fortress and they were trapped inside with automated defenses that were systematically taking them down. Vex realized they had made a terrible mistake. This was not a simple ranch. This was something else entirely. Whoever lived here had resources and skills that normal colonists did not have. He shouted for everyone to fall back and regroup, but there was nowhere to fall back to. The turrets covered every angle and the doors were sealed. His team was being picked off one by one and there was nothing he could do about it. Jake and Linda stood in a hidden bunker beneath the barn and watched everything on holographic displays. The displays showed every room in the house from multiple angles. They could see the raiders panicking and trying to find cover. They could see their weapons and their heat signatures and their heart rates. Jake's fingers moved across a control panel with the ease of long practice. Each touch changed something in the house. More turrets emerged or shields adjusted their positions. He was not trying to kill anyone, but he was definitely trying to make them regret their decision to come here. Linda stood next to him and monitored the exterior sensors. She wanted to make sure there were no more raiders outside or waiting in vehicles. The displays showed the desert empty, except for the small ship the raiders had left behind the hills. She marked its location for later. Jake had built the bunker himself over 3 years. It connected to the house through an underground tunnel that was hidden behind a false wall in their bedroom closet. The bunker had its own power supply and air system and enough food and water for a month. It also had direct control of every defensive system in the house and around the property. When they first moved to the ranch, Jake told Linda they should stay ready just in case. She agreed, because they both knew that the frontier attracted dangerous people. They spent months installing hidden systems and backup measures. To anyone who looked, the ranch was simple and basic, but underneath it was a fortress. Now that preparation was paying off. The raiders in the house were completely outmatched and they were starting to realize it. Jake could have ended the fight in the first 10 seconds, but he wanted to give them a chance to understand their situation first. Fear was a better teacher than violence. On the displays, one of the raiders destroyed a turret with concentrated fire. Jake smiled a little and activated 2 more turrets to replace it. The raider's face showed shock when the new guns emerged. That shock turned to panic when they started firing. Kara was still trying to hack the house systems. Linda noticed her efforts and shook her head. The security encryption they used was custom built by Linda herself when she worked in military intelligence. It had 77 layers of protection and would take years to break even with advanced computers. A handheld tablet had no chance. Jake opened a communication channel to the house speakers again. His voice came out calm, but there was steel underneath. He told the raiders they had made a critical error in judgment. He told them they had 30 seconds to surrender, or the turrets would switch from stun to lethal mode. It was a bluff because Jake had no intention of killing anyone if he could avoid it. But the raiders did not know that. They heard the threat and believed it because everything else about the situation said this person was serious. Vex shouted back, asking who they were. He wanted to know how a simple rancher had military defense systems. He wanted to know why they were not just calling the colonial authorities. Jake considered the question and decided to answer honestly. He told Vex his name, just his name and nothing else. Jake Morrison. He said it quietly and waited. At first, nothing happened. Then Kara's face went pale and she dropped her tablet. She looked up at the ceiling where the voice was coming from and her mouth opened, but no words came out. Next to her, another raider named Pete also reacted. His eyes went wide and he lowered his weapon. Vex did not recognize the name at first. He was younger than some of his crew, and his education in military history was limited. But Pete knew, and Pete started backing toward the door. He was shaking his head and saying no over and over again. Jake activated another display in the house. This one showed his military service record. The information scrolled across a wall where all the raiders could see it. Admiral Jake Morrison, Commander of the Earth Defense Fleet Special Operations Division, 43 years of service. Veteran of more battles and operations than most people could count. The record showed medals and commendations and mission reports that were still partially classified. It showed a career built on impossible victories and decisions that saved millions of lives. It showed a man who was a legend in military circles even though most civilians had never heard of him. Vex read the information and felt his stomach drop. He knew some of those battle names. Everyone who lived in the outer colonies knew about the Centauri Wars and the Siege of New Terra. Those were the conflicts that made human expansion into deep space possible. And this man had been at the center of all of it. More information appeared on another wall. This time it was Linda's service record. Captain Linda Morrison, Special Forces Intelligence Division, 28 years of service. Expert in tactics and electronic warfare and interrogation. The kind of person who could break into any system and extract any information and never leave a trace. The raiders stood frozen and looked at the records in horror. They had tried to rob two of the most dangerous people in human space. People who had fought against trained soldiers and pirates and alien threats. People who had resources and skills that normal colonists could never match. Jake's voice came through the speakers again. He said the doors would open in 60 seconds. He said the raiders could leave their weapons and walk out and never come back. He said if they did that, he would not report the incident to the authorities. They could leave with their lives, and that was more mercy than they deserved. Or they could stay and see what happened when he stopped being patient. The choice was theirs. Vex did not hesitate. He dropped his rifle and ran for the front door. The metal barrier was still down, but he knew it would open soon. Behind him, Kara and Pete and the others did the same. They left their weapons in piles and dragged their unconscious teammates toward the exits. The barrier slid up exactly 60 seconds later. The raiders poured out of the house like water from a broken dam. They ran across the desert toward their ship and did not look back. Some of them were crying. All of them were terrified. In the bunker, Linda watched them go and smiled. She looked at her husband and he looked back. They did not need to say anything. This was not the first time someone had underestimated them, and it probably would not be the last. Jake shut down the active defense systems and left only the passive sensors running. The turrets retracted into the walls and the shields powered down. In a few minutes, the house looked normal again. Just a simple ranch home with nothing unusual about it. They waited another hour to make sure the raiders were really gone. The sensors showed the ship taking off and climbing into the sky. It accelerated hard and jumped to faster than light speed as soon as it cleared the atmosphere, running away as fast as the engines could manage. Jake and Linda walked back through the tunnel to the house. They stepped over the abandoned weapons and looked at the minor damage from the fight. A few bullet holes in the walls and some broken furniture. Nothing they could not fix in an afternoon. Linda started making breakfast while Jake gathered the weapons. He would turn them over to the colonial authorities later, with a simple story about raiders who ran away. The sheriff would ask questions, but he would not push too hard. Everyone in the local government suspected that Jake was more than he appeared, but nobody wanted to know the details. The colonial authorities arrived 3 hours after sunrise, and Sheriff Dan Carter was not happy about being called out to the Morrison Ranch. He had been sheriff of this territory for 8 years, and he learned early that some questions were better left unasked. The Morrison place was at the top of that list. He stepped out of his air car and looked at the scene. Weapons piled up near the front door, scorch marks on the walls, and Jake Morrison standing on the porch drinking coffee like nothing unusual had happened. Dan sighed and walked forward with his deputy Amy Hughes following close behind. Amy was new to the job and still learned how things worked out here. She was young and eager and thought everything should be done by the book. Dan knew better. The frontier had its own rules, and sometimes the official regulations did not quite fit reality. Jake greeted them both and offered coffee, which Dan accepted, and Amy declined. They stood on the porch and looked at the evidence of the fight. Dan counted 12 rifles and various sidearms. All of them were expensive and well-maintained, the kind of weapons that professional criminals carried. Dan asked what happened, and Jake told him a simple story. Raiders broke into his house before dawn. He and Linda defended themselves using their security system. The raiders decided to leave and abandoned their weapons. Nobody was seriously hurt, and the raiders were gone now. It was a clean story that explained everything and raised no uncomfortable questions. Dan knew there was more to it, but he also knew that pushing for details would not help anyone. If Jake Morrison said raiders attacked and then left, then that was what happened. The fact that the security system of a simple ranch could defeat 12 armed criminals was something Dan chose not to think about too much. Amy had more questions. She wanted to know what kind of security system could do that. She wanted to see the footage and interview both Jake and Linda separately. She wanted to process the scene like a crime investigation. Dan put a hand on her shoulder and shook his head slightly. Linda came out with a data chip and handed it to Dan. She said it contained all the security footage from the incident. Dan took it and thanked her. He knew the footage would show exactly what they said happened and nothing more. Any classified systems or capabilities would be edited out. The Morrison family was very good at protecting their secrets. Dan asked if they could identify any of the raiders. Jake said he got some biometric data that might help and pulled out another chip. Dan took that one too and promised to run it through the criminal databases. He suspected they would find matches because these raiders had probably hit other places. Amy walked around the property and took pictures. She documented the bullet holes and the weapon pile and the general layout. She was building a case file even though Dan knew nothing would come of it. The raiders were gone and the Morrison family was not pressing charges. Case closed. After an hour, Dan and Amy packed up and prepared to leave. Dan stopped at his air car and looked back at Jake. He wanted to say something about how unusual this whole situation was. How a retired couple should not be able to fight off a dozen armed raiders. How the weapons and tactics suggested military training. But he did not say any of those things. Instead, he just nodded and thanked Jake for cooperating. Jake nodded back and they both understood what was not being said. Some veterans wanted to be left alone and earned that right through service. Dan respected that even if he did not know the details. The air car lifted off and headed back toward the colonial capital. Amy immediately started asking questions about why they did not investigate more thoroughly. Dan listened and then explained how the frontier worked. Some people had pasts they did not talk about and skills they did not advertise. As long as they were not causing trouble, the law gave them space. Meanwhile, 500 miles away, the raider ship landed at a smuggler station in orbit around the colony world. The surviving raiders stumbled out and headed straight for the nearest bar. They needed drinks, and they needed them fast because their hands were still shaking. Vex sat at a corner table and ordered the strongest alcohol they had. Kara sat across from him and stared at nothing. Pete and the others grabbed their own drinks and huddled together. They looked like people who survived something terrible and could not quite believe they were still alive. Word spread fast in places like this. Within an hour, everyone on the station knew that Vex's crew hit a ranch and got destroyed. People wanted details, and the raiders were drunk enough to talk. They told the story of automated defenses and military-grade security. They told about the voice that gave them a warning they should have listened to. And they told about the name, Admiral Jake Morrison. Some people laughed when they heard it because they thought it was a joke or an exaggeration, but others got quiet and looked at each other with understanding. They knew that name from stories and legends. They knew what it meant. An old smuggler named Ruth sat at the bar and listened to the conversation. She was in her 60s and had been running cargo in the outer colonies for 40 years. Before that, she served in the Earth Defense Fleet during the Centauri Wars. She knew Jake Morrison personally. Ruth turned around and told everyone to shut up and listen. She said she served under Morrison 20 years ago. She said he was the kind of officer who never asked his people to do anything he would not do himself. The kind who held impossible positions and won battles that should have been losses. She told them about the Battle of Proxima Station, where Morrison commanded a single destroyer against 5 pirate cruisers. He held them off for 6 hours while civilian transports evacuated. By the time reinforcements arrived, his ship was barely functioning, but the civilians were safe and 3 of the pirate ships were destroyed. She told them about the boarding of the Iron Wind, where Morrison personally led a team onto a hijacked colony ship. 40 hijackers against 12 Special Forces soldiers. Morrison's team took the ship back with no civilian casualties. The hijackers either surrendered or got knocked unconscious, but none of them died because Morrison did not believe in killing when other options existed. Ruth finished her drink and looked around the bar. She said any criminal with half a brain would avoid that ranch from now on. She said Morrison earned his retirement and anyone who disturbed it deserved what they got. Then she left and the bar stayed quiet for a long time after. The story spread through the criminal networks like fire through dry grass. Within days, every pirate and smuggler and raider in the sector knew about the ranch on Kepler 442b. They knew an old couple lived there, simple ranchers who raised cattle and minded their own business. But they also knew those ranchers used to be legends. They knew the old man was Admiral Morrison, who fought in more battles than most people could imagine. They knew the old woman was Captain Morrison, who could break into any system and extract any secret. Some criminals did not believe the stories. They thought it was exaggeration or myth. Those people sometimes made the mistake of testing it themselves. They would approach the ranch to scout it or maybe steal something small. The security systems would detect them and Jake would send them running with warning shots and a message to stay away. After a few more incidents, the word became absolute. You did not go near the Morrison Ranch. You did not even fly over it if you could avoid it. It was marked territory, and the penalty for trespassing was more than anyone wanted to pay. Back on the ranch, Jake and Linda continued their normal routine. They fixed the bullet holes and replaced the broken furniture. They tended the cattle and worked on the fences. Life went back to being quiet and simple, just the way they liked it. 3 months passed without any more incidents, and life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Jake woke up every morning before sunrise and made coffee while Linda checked the overnight security logs. They ate breakfast together and planned their work for the day. Then they went out and did the actual labor of running a cattle ranch. The work was hard but satisfying in a way his old job never was. When Jake fixed a fence, he could see the result immediately. The cattle stayed where they were supposed to be, and that was success. When he repaired a water pump, the animals had clean water to drink. Simple cause and effect with no politics or bureaucracy in between. Linda preferred working with the crops they grew in the small fields behind the barn. She said it reminded her of her childhood before she joined the military. Her parents had a farm on Earth, and she spent her early years learning how things grew. Then she left for the academy and spent 30 years doing things that had nothing to do with farming. Now she was back to it and happy about the change. She grew vegetables that did well in the alien soil with some modifications, tomatoes and carrots and beans that tasted like home. She sold the excess at the local market, and people said her produce was the best in the territory. The local community slowly accepted them over the years. At first, people were suspicious of newcomers, especially ones who kept to themselves. But Jake and Linda were good neighbors when it mattered. They helped when someone's equipment broke down. They shared supplies during shortages. They attended community meetings and voted on local issues. Nobody asked too many questions about their past. On the frontier, most people had reasons for being there, and those reasons were often private. You judged folks by their actions, not their history. Jake and Linda proved themselves through work and reliability and eventually became just another part of the landscape. The incident with the raiders was talked about for a while, but then faded from daily conversation. Sheriff Dan Carter filed his report and marked the case closed. The weapons were logged and stored. The biometric data matched several known criminals and warrants were issued, but nobody expected those warrants to be served. The raiders were long gone. Dan sometimes drove past the ranch on his regular patrols and always slowed down to look. He still wondered exactly what Jake and Linda had done in their previous careers. The official records showed they were military veterans with honorable discharges, but the details were classified. That level of classification meant something important. Amy, his deputy, asked him about it once. She wanted to know why they did not investigate the Morrison place more thoroughly. Dan told her the truth, which was that some mysteries were better left alone. The Morrison family was not causing trouble, and in fact had stopped trouble from spreading to other ranches. That was enough. The colony itself was growing slowly but steadily. More families arrived every month looking for new opportunities. The population of the main settlement reached 5,000 people. New businesses opened and schools expanded. The government started talking about upgrading from colonial status to full membership in the Federation. Jake watched the changes from a distance. He was glad the colony was succeeding, but he had no desire to get involved in expansion politics. He served his time working on big-picture problems. Now he focused on small-picture concerns like whether the north pasture had enough grass and if the barn roof would survive the next storm season. Linda was the same way. She attended community meetings but never volunteered for committees or leadership positions. She voted and paid her taxes and helped her neighbors but kept clear boundaries between her public and private life. People respected that and did not push. One afternoon, a young couple came to the ranch asking about buying some cattle. Their names were Chris and Maria, and they just bought land 10 miles east. They wanted to start their own herd, but did not know much about ranching yet. Jake spent 2 hours teaching them basics and sold them 5 cows at a fair price. Chris asked if Jake had any advice for new ranchers. Jake thought about it and said the most important thing was consistency. Show up every day and do the work. Fix problems when they were small before they became big. Treat the animals with respect because they depended on you. Simple lessons that applied to more than just ranching. Maria asked Linda about the gardens and got similar advice. Start small and learn as you go. Pay attention to what works in the local soil and climate. Do not try to force earth crops to grow exactly like they did at home. Adapt and be patient. The young couple left happy and grateful. Jake watched them drive away and felt good about helping. This was the kind of interaction he enjoyed. Direct and honest with immediate practical results. No hidden agendas or complex politics. That evening, Jake and Linda sat on their porch and watched the sunset like they did most nights. The sky turned orange and purple and the temperature dropped fast once the suns were down. Jake thought about the raiders who attacked 3 months ago and wondered where they were now. He hoped they learned their lesson and found honest work. He hoped they told other criminals to stay away from his ranch. But mostly he hoped they just forgot about him and Linda and moved on with their lives. The past was the past and should stay there. Linda seemed to read his thoughts because she said they did the right thing letting the raiders go. Jake agreed. Violence should always be a last resort, not a first choice. They could have killed all 12 raiders easily, but that would have just created more problems. Bodies meant investigations, and investigations meant attention they did not want. Better to scare them and send them running. Fear spread faster than facts and was more effective at keeping people away. Now other criminals knew there was a ranch they should avoid. The invisible fence of reputation was stronger than any physical barrier. The communication terminal inside made its soft chime sound. Jake ignored it like he usually did, but Linda stood up and said maybe they should check it this time. Something in her tone made Jake follow her inside. The message was from Fleet Command, which was unusual. Jake had not heard from them in 5 years since his retirement. He opened the message and read it slowly. His expression did not change, but Linda knew him well enough to see the slight tension in his shoulders. Fleet Command was requesting his presence at a ceremony in 6 months. They were commissioning a new dreadnought and naming it after his old ship. They wanted him there for the official launch. It was not an order, but it was strongly encouraged. The message included travel arrangements and a formal invitation. Linda read over his shoulder and then looked at her husband's face. She asked if he wanted to go. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Part of him wanted to say no and stay here where life was simple. But another part of him was curious to see the new ship and meet the young officers who would serve on it. He told Linda he would think about it. She nodded and went back to the porch. Jake stood in the kitchen and looked at the message for a while longer. His old life was calling and he was not sure how to answer. 2 weeks after the message from Fleet Command, a small ship appeared on the ranch sensors. Jake was in the barn working on a broken irrigation pump when the alert came through on his handheld device. He looked at the screen and saw a single craft approaching from orbit. The identification beacon marked it as a Colonial Navy courier. Linda was in the house and saw the same alert. She called Jake on the comm and asked if he was expecting anyone. Jake said no, but the ship was official military, so they should probably receive it properly. He wiped his hands on a cloth and walked out of the barn toward the landing area they kept clear for supply ships. The courier ship descended smoothly and settled onto the dirt with barely a sound. It was a small vessel designed for speed and efficiency, the kind used for important messages and personnel transport. The engines powered down, and after a moment the hatch opened. A young man in a crisp naval uniform stepped out and stood at attention. He could not have been more than 25 years old. His uniform showed the rank of lieutenant, and his insignia indicated he was assigned to Fleet Command headquarters. He looked nervous as Jake approached. The lieutenant saluted sharply and introduced himself as Ben Hayes. He said he was here to deliver a message from the Fleet Admiral personally. Jake returned the salute out of habit and then told the lieutenant to relax. They were on a ranch, not a military base. Ben lowered his hand but did not relax much. He kept glancing around at the ranch house and the barn as if expecting something more impressive. Jake could tell the young officer had heard stories and was trying to reconcile them with the simple homestead in front of him. Linda came out to join them, and Ben saluted her too. She smiled and invited him inside for coffee. The lieutenant accepted gratefully and followed them into the house. He sat at the kitchen table and looked around at the comfortable but plain interior. Jake poured coffee while Linda cut slices of fresh bread. Ben pulled a sealed container from his uniform and placed it on the table. He said the Fleet Admiral wanted Jake to have this personally and would not trust it to a regular communication channel. Jake opened the container and found a medal inside along with a formal letter. The medal was new and gleamed in the kitchen light. It was the Solar Cross, which was the highest honor the military could award. Jake already had one from his service, but this was different. The letter explained that Fleet Command was naming the new dreadnought Morrison in honor of his career and contributions. They wanted him at the commissioning ceremony not just as a guest, but as the ship's official sponsor. The letter also mentioned that recruitment numbers were up significantly across the outer colonies. Young people were inspired by stories about veterans like Jake who served with honor and then retired to help build the frontier. Fleet Command thought his attendance at the ceremony would boost morale and show current service members what they could achieve. Jake read the letter twice and then set it down. He looked at Linda, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The decision was his to make. Ben waited quietly and sipped his coffee. He clearly had instructions to bring back an answer. Jake asked about the ship itself. Ben immediately brightened and started describing the Morrison with obvious enthusiasm. It was a Galaxy-class dreadnought with the latest weapon systems and defensive technology, the most advanced ship in the fleet designed for deep space operations. It would carry a crew of 800 and serve as the flagship for frontier defense. The young lieutenant talked about shield generators and faster-than-light engines and tactical capabilities. Jake listened and recognized the same excitement he felt when he was that age. The eagerness to serve and make a difference and be part of something bigger than yourself. It was a good feeling, and Jake missed it sometimes. Ben also mentioned that several officers who served under Jake were now in senior positions throughout the fleet. They were leading their own ships and training the next generation. Jake's methods and tactics were still taught at the academy. His decisions during critical battles were studied as examples of clear thinking under pressure. Jake interrupted and asked about casualties. Ben looked confused for a moment and then understood the question. He said current fleet doctrine emphasized minimizing losses on both sides of any conflict. Stunning weapons and non-lethal tactics were standard now, just like Jake always preferred. The military learned from his example that winning did not require maximum destruction. That answer pleased Jake more than all the talk about advanced technology. He asked Ben if he ever saw combat. The lieutenant shook his head and admitted he was mostly assigned to administrative duties. He wanted a ship posting, but so far had only done courier runs and desk work. Jake told him to be patient. The boring jobs built skills that would matter later. Learning logistics and personnel management was just as important as tactical training. Every role in the military contributed to the whole. Ben nodded, but Jake could see the young man still dreamed of adventure. Linda asked, Ben about his family and he talked about his parents who lived on Mars. They were proud he joined the Navy and supported his career, even though they worried about him. His father was a teacher, and his mother worked in environmental systems. Normal people living normal lives. After an hour of conversation, Jake made his decision. He told Ben he would attend the ceremony if his schedule allowed. He still had a ranch to run and could not leave for too long, but 6 months was enough time to arrange for neighbors to watch the cattle. He would be there. Ben looked relieved and thanked him. He finished his coffee and stood to leave. As he walked back to his ship, he turned and asked one more question. He asked if the stories were true about Jake holding a corridor against 40 Marines during a boarding action. He heard it at the academy but wondered if it was exaggerated. Jake smiled and said most stories grew in the telling. The truth was usually less dramatic than the legend. But yes, he did hold a corridor once because his crew needed time to evacuate, and he was the only one in position to slow the enemy down. It was not heroic, just necessary. Ben saluted one more time and climbed into his ship. The engines powered up and the courier lifted off smoothly. Jake and Linda watched it climb into the sky until it was just a bright point of light. Then they went back to work because the irrigation pump was still broken and the cattle needed water. That evening, Jake sent a formal acceptance message to Fleet Command. He would attend the commissioning ceremony and serve as sponsor for the new ship. It felt strange to be pulled back toward his old life, but also right somehow. He earned his peace through service, but that did not mean he had to hide from it. Linda asked if he was nervous about seeing old colleagues and attending a big formal event. Jake admitted he was a little nervous. He had gotten used to quiet days and simple work. The ceremony would be full of speeches and crowds and attention. All the things he moved to the frontier to escape, but it was also important. The young officers needed examples to follow. They needed to see that a full career of service was possible and honorable. They needed to know that retirement was not failure, but an earned reward. If his attendance helped even one person, then it was worth the discomfort. 3 months passed and life continued at its normal pace. Jake and Linda made arrangements for their neighbors to care for the ranch while they were gone. They packed formal clothes they had not worn in years. They reviewed the ceremony schedule and travel plans. The night before they were supposed to leave, Jake stood on the porch and looked at his land. The cattle were bedded down for the night and the fields were quiet. The stars overhead were bright and clear. This place was his home now and he would be glad to return to it. But first he had one more duty to perform. One more appearance as Admiral Morrison before he could come back to being Jake the rancher. He was ready. The journey to the Fleet Command headquarters took 2 days through faster-than-light space. Jake and Linda traveled on a comfortable passenger liner that made regular runs between the frontier colonies and the core worlds. They had a private cabin and spent most of the trip reading and watching the stars blur past through the viewport. Jake felt out of place wearing his formal uniform again. The dark blue fabric was stiff with medals and ribbons across the chest. Linda wore her dress uniform too and looked more comfortable in it than he felt. She had always been better at formal occasions and diplomatic situations. He preferred being in the field where things were straightforward. The liner docked at Gateway Station, which orbited Earth. From there, a shuttle took them down to Fleet Command headquarters in Geneva. The city looked different than Jake remembered. Taller buildings and more air traffic. But the headquarters itself was exactly the same. A massive complex of glass and steel that housed the military leadership of human space. An aide met them at the shuttle pad and escorted them through security. Officers and enlisted personnel stopped and stared as they walked past. Some whispered to each other and pointed. Jake heard his name mentioned several times. He kept his eyes forward and maintained a neutral expression. They were taken to guest quarters in the officer housing block. The rooms were clean and functional with a view of the lake. The aide said the ceremony would begin at 10:00 hours the next morning. Jake and Linda had the evening to themselves to rest and prepare. After the aide left, Linda sat on the bed and looked at her husband. She asked how he was feeling. Jake admitted he was more nervous than he expected. He spent his career leading operations and making decisions that affected thousands of people. But this was different. This was about being a symbol, and he was never comfortable with that role. Linda reminded him that symbols mattered to people. Young officers needed heroes to look up to. Veterans needed to know their service was remembered and valued. His presence at the ceremony meant something even if he did not enjoy the attention. They had dinner in the officers' mess and ran into several people Jake served with over the years. Some were retired like him and others were still active duty in senior positions. They talked about old times and caught up on news. Everyone wanted to know about the ranch and how Jake was adjusting to civilian life. Jake told them the truth, which was that he loved it. The work was hard but honest, and the results were immediate. No politics or paperwork, just cattle and crops and fixing things that broke. Several of the retired officers nodded with understanding. They talked about their own struggles adjusting to peace after decades of war. One man named Carl, who used to serve as Jake's chief engineer, was now living on a colony world and teaching at a technical school. He said working with students was rewarding in ways combat never was. He could see his impact on their lives and watch them grow into capable professionals. That kind of satisfaction was worth more than any medal. The conversation shifted to current events in the fleet. A woman named Helen, who commanded a cruiser squadron, talked about increased piracy in the outer regions. Criminal organizations were getting bolder and better armed. The fleet was responding, but resources were stretched thin across so much territory. Jake listened but did not offer opinions. He was retired and current operations were not his responsibility anymore. But he could see the same challenges he dealt with during his career were still present. Humanity had spread across the galaxy faster than its ability to maintain order. The frontier would always attract people who wanted to escape the law. The evening ended and Jake returned to his quarters feeling tired, but also energized. Seeing old friends and hearing about their lives reminded him why he served. The people mattered more than the missions. Protecting others and building something better was always the goal, even when the methods were violent. The next morning, Jake put on his full dress uniform and checked his appearance in the mirror. The man looking back was older than he remembered. Gray hair and lines around the eyes, but he stood straight and the uniform fit well. He looked like what he was, a veteran who earned his rank through years of service. Linda adjusted his medals and straightened his collar. She looked elegant in her own uniform with her hair pulled back. They looked like a command team, which is what they always were, partners in war and peace. The ceremony was held at the main shipyard in orbit above Earth. Another shuttle took them up and they arrived 30 minutes early. The shipyard was enormous with dozens of vessels in various stages of construction. The Morrison was docked at the central berth and dominated the view. It was huge and sleek and powerful looking. Jake stood at a viewport and studied his namesake ship. The hull was dark gray with fleet markings along the sides. Weapon ports and shield generators were visible across the surface. Launch bays for fighters and support craft. It looked like what it was, a ship designed to project power and protect people. Crew members were already aboard running final system checks. In a few weeks, the Morrison would leave on its first patrol of the frontier sectors. Jake wondered what challenges the crew would face and what decisions the captain would need to make. He hoped they were ready but knew you could never fully prepare for war. The ceremony began exactly on time. Fleet admirals and government officials sat in rows facing the ship. Media crews recorded everything for broadcast across human space. Jake and Linda were seated in the front row next to the fleet admiral who welcomed them warmly. The speeches started, and Jake listened politely. Officials talked about the importance of the fleet and the sacrifice of those who served. They mentioned Jake's career and called him an example of the best humanity had to offer. The praise made him uncomfortable, but he kept his face neutral. Then it was time for the actual commissioning. The fleet admiral called Jake forward and handed him a ceremonial bottle. Jake stood at a podium facing the crowd and the cameras. He looked at the young faces in the audience, officers and crew members who would serve on the Morrison and other ships throughout the fleet. He kept his speech short. He said he was honored by the recognition, but insisted that ships were only as good as the people who served on them. The Morrison would succeed or fail based on the dedication and skill of its crew. He urged them to take care of each other and remember why they served. Protect the innocent and build something worth defending. Then he broke the bottle against the ship's hull in the traditional way. The crowd applauded and the Morrison was officially commissioned into service. Engines powered up and the ship began its first independent movements. It separated from the dock and moved under its own power, beautiful and deadly and ready. After the ceremony, there was a reception where Jake met the Morrison's captain and senior officers. The captain was a sharp woman named Kate, who asked intelligent questions about frontier operations. Jake liked her immediately and felt confident the ship was in good hands. Young officers approached throughout the reception wanting to meet him and ask questions. Jake answered as best he could and tried to be encouraging. He saw himself in their eagerness and hoped they would have long, successful careers that ended in peaceful retirement like his. But he also warned them about the costs of service, the friends they would lose and the decisions that would haunt them, the nights they would lie awake wondering if they did the right thing. Military service was honorable, but it was not easy, and they should understand that going in. The reception ended and Jake and Linda returned to their quarters exhausted. The next day they would fly back to their ranch and normal life. But for now they sat together and talked about the ceremony. Linda said Jake did well and the speech hit the right tone. He gave people something to believe in without being arrogant about it. Jake thought about the Morrison leaving on its first patrol. He hoped the crew stayed safe and came home without casualties. He hoped the captain made good decisions and the officers worked as a team. Most of all, he hoped the ship lived up to its name not through violence but through the protection of those who could not protect themselves. That was always the goal, and always would be. The passenger liner dropped out of faster-than-light space and approached Kepler 442b 3 days after the ceremony. Jake stood at the viewport and watched his adopted home planet grow larger. The red deserts and scattered settlements looked beautiful after the crowded core worlds. This was where he belonged now. Linda stood next to him and smiled. She was ready to be home too. The ceremony was important but exhausting. Too many people and too much attention. The ranch would be quiet and peaceful and exactly what they needed. No more speeches or formal events. Just work and sunsets and the simple satisfaction of caring for animals. Their neighbors Chris and Maria met them at the colonial spaceport with a borrowed truck. They reported that the cattle were healthy and the ranch had no problems during the absence. One fence needed repair from a storm, but they already fixed it. Everything was exactly as Jake and Linda left it. The drive back to the ranch took an hour across the desert roads. Chris talked about his own herd and asked advice about breeding. Maria mentioned that their crops were doing well using the techniques Linda taught them. They were good neighbors and Jake was glad they moved to the area. At the ranch, everything looked normal. The house stood solid and unchanged. The barn was exactly where it should be. The cattle grazed in the pasture without concern. Jake felt tension leave his shoulders that he did not know he was carrying. This was home and it welcomed him back. Chris and Maria left after helping unload supplies. Jake and Linda walked through the house checking that everything was in order. The security systems had logged a few animal movements, but nothing concerning. The hidden defenses were exactly as they left them, ready but not needed. That evening they sat on the porch and watched the twin suns set. Neither spoke for a long time. They did not need to. The quiet was enough. Jake sipped coffee and thought about the Morrison beginning its patrol somewhere in deep space. He hoped the ship and crew stayed safe. Linda broke the silence and asked if he was glad they went to the ceremony. Jake thought about the question and nodded. It was good to see old friends and meet the new officers. It was good to know the fleet was in capable hands. But he was also glad it was over and he could return to being just a rancher. Over the next few weeks, life settled back into its normal rhythm. Jake worked on projects around the ranch that he delayed before the trip. He rebuilt a section of fence with stronger posts. He upgraded the barn door that stuck in humid weather. Small problems with practical solutions. Linda expanded her garden with new varieties of vegetables. She spent hours working the soil and planting seeds. The work was meditative and she found it cleared her mind better than anything else. No stress or danger, just growth and patience and the reward of fresh food. One afternoon, Sheriff Dan Carter drove out to the ranch on his regular patrol. He stopped and chatted with Jake about local news. There was talk of a new settlement being established 50 miles north. The colonial government approved funding for a school expansion. Normal community business. Dan mentioned that piracy incidents were down in their sector over the past few months. Jake asked if there was a reason. Dan smiled and said word had spread about what happened to raiders who caused trouble near certain ranches. Criminals were steering clear of the area now. Reputation was better than walls. Jake did not comment, but he understood. The incident months ago had achieved exactly what he intended. A clear message that some places were not worth attacking. Other ranchers in the region benefited from increased security without knowing why. That was fine with Jake. Protection did not need recognition. A few weeks later, a message arrived from Lieutenant Ben Hayes, who delivered the invitation to the ceremony. He was assigned to the Morrison as communications officer. His first ship posting. He thanked Jake for attending the ceremony and said it meant a lot to the crew. He promised to serve with honor. Jake replied with a short message wishing him luck and reminding him to listen to his senior officers. Youth and enthusiasm were valuable, but experience and caution kept people alive. Ben should learn everything he could and remember that every role on a ship mattered. Jake hoped the young officer would have a long career. Months passed and seasons changed on Kepler 442b. The rains came and turned the desert briefly green. The cattle had calves and the herd grew. Jake and Linda celebrated their anniversary with a quiet dinner at home. They talked about the future and agreed they were exactly where they wanted to be. Chris and Maria's ranch prospered, and they asked Jake to help them expand their operation. He spent several days teaching them advanced techniques and helping them plan new pastures. Watching them succeed gave him satisfaction. Building something positive in the frontier was important work. One evening, Linda found Jake standing at the fence line looking at the sunset. She asked what he was thinking about. Jake said he was thinking about legacy. His military career was over, but its effects continued through the officers he trained and the ship that bore his name. His ranch was small, but it helped the community grow stronger. He said he spent most of his life preparing for war and fighting battles. He was good at it and saved lives through his actions. But building a ranch and helping neighbors and raising cattle was just as important, maybe more important because it created something instead of just protecting against loss. Linda agreed and said they earned this peace through decades of hard service. They paid their dues and made their sacrifices. Now they could enjoy the simple pleasure of honest work and quiet evenings. No regrets about what they left behind because they gave everything they had when it mattered. A ship appeared on the security sensors, and Jake checked the display. It was another courier vessel, but not military this time. A civilian transport carrying mail and packages to frontier settlements. Jake walked out to meet it when it landed. The pilot handed him a package marked with fleet insignia. Jake signed for it and took it back to the house. Inside was a photo of the Morrison in space with its crew assembled on deck. Lieutenant Ben Hayes was visible in the front row looking proud. A note said the crew wanted Jake to have it as thanks for his service and inspiration. Jake put the photo on the shelf in the living room next to pictures of him and Linda through the years. Young faces in military uniforms. Older faces at their wedding. Recent photos on the ranch. A whole life captured in images. The Morrison photo fit perfectly with the rest. Past and present connected. That night, Jake and Linda lay in bed and listened to the wind outside. The house creaked slightly in familiar ways. The security system hummed quietly in the background. Everything was as it should be. Jake thought about the path that brought him here, the decisions he made and the prices he paid, the lives he saved and the friends he lost. It was a hard road, but an honorable one. He did his best, and that had to be enough. Linda reached over and took his hand. She knew what he was thinking without asking. She thought about her own career and choices, the intelligence work and dangerous missions, the secrets she kept and operations she ran. She had no regrets either. They both did what needed to be done. The next morning, Jake woke before sunrise like always. He made coffee and watched the darkness fade to gray, then orange. Another day on the ranch. Another chance to do simple, useful work. He was grateful for it. Linda joined him and they planned their tasks. A water pump needed maintenance. The south fence required inspection. Basic chores that kept the ranch running. They finished breakfast and headed out to start work. The cattle were already stirring and would need attention soon. The crops required watering. The machines needed checking. Endless small tasks that added up to a functioning ranch. Jake grabbed his tools and Linda got the equipment ready. They moved with the efficiency of long practice. By mid-morning, the work was well underway. Jake replaced seals in the water pump while Linda inspected fence posts. The sun was bright and the air was clear. Good weather for outdoor work. They would finish before the heat of the afternoon made labor difficult. A young couple drove up the road in an old truck. New settlers looking for advice about starting a ranch. Jake recognized the pattern. The frontier attracted people looking for fresh starts. He washed his hands and walked over to greet them. Linda came from the fence line to join him. The couple introduced themselves as Paul and Sarah and asked basic questions about cattle and crops. Jake answered patiently and offered to show them around the property. They walked through the pastures and barn while Jake explained systems and techniques. The same information he shared with Chris and Maria months ago. Paul asked if ranching was difficult. Jake said yes, but also rewarding. Hard work with visible results. You got out what you put in? Sarah asked about dangers. Jake mentioned weather and equipment failures and occasional predators. He did not mention raiders or criminals. That information would only scare them and was not relevant anymore. After an hour, the young couple thanked them and left with notes and recommendations. Jake watched them drive away and hoped they succeeded. The frontier needed people willing to work hard and build communities. Every successful ranch made the region stronger and more stable. Linda returned to the fence inspection and Jake finished the water pump. By early afternoon, both jobs were complete. They ate lunch on the porch and watched the cattle graze. Peaceful and productive.